Hi, welcome back to Kinesis PT and Performance. Today we're going to be talking about hip hinging. So a hip hinge is an athletic movement we use in squats, deadlifts, RDLs, lunges. Pretty much any athletic movement and training movement incorporates some sort of a hip hinge. Unfortunately, most athletes and most people can't perform this correctly, and most trainers cannot coach this. It's a super important movement in terms of function and maintaining the health of your low back, your hips, your shoulders, your body as a whole. When I was a PT student, one of my CIs told me the best core exercise was a deadlift. And I remember looking at him like he was crazy. But stay tuned, watch how we coach through this hip hinge, and you will see why a deadlift is such a great core exercise. So Kayleen has been kind enough to allow me to coach her through this hip hinge. We've actually had her take her shirt off because she has a real baggy shirt on, and I want us to be able to appreciate the position of her lumbar spine, her pelvis, but also see the transverse abdominis and obliques kind of repositioning the rib cage. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to show you the gist of a hip hinge before we go through discussing the ins and outs of it. So if we can turn this way, sideways, it doesn't matter which way, sideways. And the idea of a hip hinge, again, is to get a solid core foundation. And we're not going to be bending at our back, but we're bending at our hips, hence the name hip hinge. So just show us a hip hinge here, Kayleen. So hips are going back and then back forward. We shouldn't really see a lot of movement at the lumbar spine, not really changing at our knees. Again, this is a hip hinge. Now this movement, again, is incorporated in deadlifts, squats, lunges, you name it. A lot of athletic movements. It's a part of triple extension. So if you've heard the term triple extension between ankle, knee, hip, this is part of that hip hinge. So the most important thing when we're going into this hip hinge is actually our setup for it. So before we even start, we need to make sure we have the correct postural alignment. So we need to get everything positioned the way it's supposed to. So we need our pelvis underneath our rib cage to help engage our core in that muscular canister. So our transverse abdominis comes up and it connects to the lower 6 ribs, so what we call the costal margin, that inside portion. And what it actually does is it weaves and interdigitates with your diaphragm, which makes the top portion of that muscular canister. Now at the bottom of the muscular canister, we have our pelvic floor. Now your respiratory diaphragm and your pelvic floor, what we call your pelvic diaphragm, they contract and relax reflexively with one another. So as your diaphragm, so your respiratory diaphragm comes up, your pelvic diaphragm comes up. As your respiratory diaphragm comes down, your pelvic diaphragm or pelvic floor comes down. So that means as we breathe, these two diaphragms are going up and down with one another. If you haven't seen my description or video on how the core functions, pause this, go and watch that so this makes a little bit more sense to you. Now, this has special implications specifically for female athletes as we're talking through, because if we do not teach them to hip hinge correctly, they're going to have mismanagement of pressures when they're doing squats, deadlifts, and lunges. We are going to stretch their pelvic floor, predisposing them to things like prolapse and other pelvic floor issues. Men, you have a pelvic floor too, so this isn't women alone. The other thing we're going to see going on is osseous approximation or impingement in the lumbar spine. So we're going to start to see the development of spondylolysis, so a defect in the pars interarticularis, and progression to a spondylolisthesis, and also FAI or hip impingement, again, because we have not set up this hip hinge correctly. So this setup is extremely important. I don't know if I can reiterate that or reinforce that enough. So what we want to see her do before we go anywhere is get to that good postural alignment. And I typically have people just do that by giving me a really good exhale. So they blow everything out. That engages their internal obliques and again, that transverse abdominis. And she did a nice job here of actually getting this lower abdominal, lower TA pulled in. Now, once we're in this position, we are set to move into our hip hinge. Go ahead and push your hips back for me and back up. Beautiful. We don't want to see any motion here. This does not move. All our motion is at the hips. One more time. Beautiful. So again, if you're working with gymnasts, dancers, figure skaters, Teaching them how to perform this hip hinge is vital to the health of their back, hips, pelvic floor, you name it. This is a foundational movement. So when working with specifically female athletes also, we need to be conscientious of where we put weight in their hands. So if we give them a barbell that's placed in front of them and place their hands super wide, we might be putting them in a position that's really hard to stabilize. So typically what I like to use with people are kettlebells. We're gonna pause the film while I grab her some kettlebells. All right, thanks for being patient. We're back. I got her kettlebells. So with these kettlebells, I can place them just wider than her feet, so just wider than shoulder width or hip width. Sometimes our trap bars get way out here, they're too wide for women, and again, it puts us into a compromised position and it's too hard for them to stabilize. So make sure we're not asking them to grab too wide. So let's show them a little hip hinge deadlift here for me. So nice good exhale, pushing our hips back and going down. Beautiful. So this would be an RDL. Let's show them a deadlift here. Beautiful. So a little bit more knee flexion, and then a squat. Even more knee flexion. So what we're doing is just kind of changing where the stress and the motion comes from hips, a little knees, equal distribution between hips and knees. Now, if you notice here, she is actually in bare feet. Go ahead and set those down. What we want to talk about too is making sure your athletes have proper footwear on when they do this. So in this type of situation, her bare foot, I know a lot of people like to do barefoot training. I'm not opposed to that as long as you have a nice soft surface underneath their foot that their foot does not have to accommodate to. The surface accommodates to their foot. So if I'm on a flat concrete surface, my foot has to pancake or pronate to get there. So my midfoot and arch, which is a very specific neurosensory input to be able to activate your glutes correctly, has to collapse to try to meet the floor. So make sure your athletes are standing on some sort of a very thin soft foam surface or something like turf, or they have proper footwear on. So good shoes with good arch support, good rear foot control and whatnot. So what we're gonna show you here is actually what Kayleen looks like in terms of the difference of her squats barefoot here, and then we're gonna grab some orthotics she had made that are specifically PRI orthotics to give her a little bit more neurosensory input and again, control her rear foot, control her calcaneus so we can be in the right position. So let's show them the squat with a good hip hinge. So there's our exhale. Good, where you feel like you can't control, back up. Notice how much trunk flexion she had there. Now these orthotics I'm gonna grab, a lot of people are like, oh, she's got a heel lift. No, there's no heel lift. There's not really any drop in this. So it's a very flat orthotic. They're made deep to cup the calcaneus, and it's got a nice high arch to basically come up and hug into her midfoot. It's not so much of a biomechanical support as it is neurosensory input. So time out as I grab those. All right, so if you look closely, you can see Kayleen's got these orthotics under her feet here. They're very, very thin, again, as a neurosensory input. And we're gonna redo this squat here. Now it's gonna be a pretty minor difference, but in terms of distribution of where she goes, we see a lot less trunk flexion because we got proper neurosensory input into her feet. So it helps her control her pelvis a lot better. Again, the pelvis is the foundation for your spine. It's the foundation for your core. So if we can't get that right, we're up a creek without a paddle. Please reach out with any questions. I hope this was informative and worth your time. Please share with a friend. Thanks for watching.